Manuel Wa-Kyendo and Exploring Economics. The question of the day is this: why should Kenyans care about currency politics? So, two major takeaways. When a currency is strong, not everyone wins. When the currency is strong, those who import win, while those who export lose. When a currency is weak, those who import lose, while those who export win. Why? When a currency is strong, domestic goods are more expensive for foreigners who want to buy them. So if you're involved in a firm that exports, well, when the currency is strong, you're losing. So how has Kenya's exchange rate been behaving of late? So in 2005, Kenya's exchange rate to the euro, the sterling pound, the Tanzania shilling, and Uganda was changing on a daily basis. But relative to the dollar, the Kenyan exchange rate remained fixed at around 129 shillings per US dollars from late 2024 and throughout the year 2025. We mentioned in a previous chapter that the way that a government manages a currency, right, keeps it in one place, is they have to spend money. You know, you have to spend money to keep a currency artificially fixed. So this brings us to this. If a currency remains artificially fixed, the government is basically picking winners from losers. If a currency is being kept artificially strong, then a government is picking importers at the expense of exporters and vice versa. But what do we observe? Kenyan reserves have remained above a certain threshold. You know, even though Kenya's exchange rate to the dollar remained fixed at 129, we don't see this money being spent. At least up to this period. Now, here's a chart that just shows you Kenya shilling relative to the dollar is in orange. It's not been moving. Kenya shilling has been weakening relative to the pound. You know, you need more shillings to buy the same amount of pounds. And it's also been weakening against the euro. How has the Kenyan shilling, or rather the euro, behaved relative to the US dollar? Look at that. Since the year 2000 all the way to 2024, there is movement, right? The Tanzania shilling and the Ugandan shilling. How has the Kenya shilling been moving against these currencies? Well, you can see there is some sort of movement. But here, this is the indicator that's supposed to tell us that if the Kenyan shilling is remaining fixed at a certain band relative to the dollar, then we should see reserves, foreign reserves being spent to keep it there. But instead, what do we see? Actually, the foreign reserves are not falling. They're actually rising. And not only are they rising, but we have 5.3 months of import cover now, I believe. No. Stock of usable foreign exchange reserves in US dollars million, and as import cover. Yeah, that's 5.3 months of import cover. So import cover just means that when the stock of foreign reserves is compared to the value of Kenyan imports, the reserves that we have are enough to cover that value of imports for 5.3 months. So, is the Kenyan shilling strong, weak, or stable? We can determine this in a few different ways. Two of them is looking at the real effective exchange rate and looking at macroeconomics indicators, the inflation and the rate at which the government sets its policy rate. This is a chart called the real effective exchange rate. What the real effective exchange rate tells us is this. The real effective exchange rate is actually the exchange rate controlled for inflation. So it's telling us when you consider inflation, is a currency getting now this is how you think about it. Kenya exports a certain basket of goods to specific markets. So does Uganda, so does Tanzania, so do other countries that are in Kenya's per capita neighborhood. Kenya, now, inflation has an effect on first of all, the exchange rate is also represents over time, right? Represents the cost of this basket of goods to Kenya's destination markets. So our flowers and tea, are Kenyan flowers and tea becoming cheaper, more expensive, or staying the same for Kenya's consumers? The final point is this. This real effective exchange rate also considers the rate of inflation. And you put all this together, it actually tells you how competitive Kenya's exports are. So, since the year 2000, Kenyan products have become more and more expensive for Kenya's consumers, for Kenya's destination markets. Kenya is becoming less competitive. Compared to who? Right, first of all, it's becoming less competitive in general, right? From the year 2000, poor management of policy, right? A poor macroeconomic fundamentals. Uganda has actually improved a little bit. You look at the index, but Kenya's per capita neighborhood has actually not deteriorated in that time, right? They got just a little worse. But look at Kenya's index moving from below 80 to 140. This movement of just about, that's almost 60 points, right? What does it mean? Kenya's competitiveness got worse by, let's see, how do we interpret this? Just a second. I'm gonna have to, I want to make sure that I actually interpret this correctly. Right? Okay, so one way to say it is that Kenya's competitiveness got worse by 200%. Look at that. The per capita neighborhood barely deteriorated in competitiveness. Uganda, the guy with the funny hat that Kenyans like to laugh about, seems to have been doing a better job at keeping his country competitive. So, on the one hand, Kenya is managing, it seems to be sort of managing its currency. We can't see how it's managing its currency because we can't see, at least from this chart so far, by the week of 30th September, we couldn't see reserves changing, right? Or rather getting lower as we would expect. But somehow the exchange rate relative to the dollar has remained relatively stable. And this is being done right now. It means, let's say if it's being kept artificially strong, because right now keeping the shilling weak would actually make Kenya's debt repayments very expensive. So we can see at least one motivation to keep it strong, if it's actually being kept artificially strong, right? Because there's suspicion. You could have suspicions, for example, that it's too strong, and that has been the opinion of some economists, right? Like Kwame Wino and Maureen Barasa, Peter Doyle. They think that the Kenyan currency is too strong and should actually be weak. It's overvalued. So Kenya's currency is overvalued while competitiveness has actually been very poor. So the government has decided to prioritize something. We think it might be debt repayments. At whose expense? At the expense of the exporter. An exporter who has been abused, judging from this chart, for all those years. My name has been Emmanuel Wa-Kyendo. We shall leave it there for today on why Kenyans should care about currency politics. Thank you.